All right, it is the B Block Podcast, and I am your host, Brandon Scott. I appreciate you for being here. It was an eventful night, Tuesday night going into Wednesday morning. Got a little bit of news in the NBA, and I say a little bit of news. This was one news nugget that I feel like sent shockwaves around the sports world and specifically the NBA world. And I actually wish that we had this news earlier in the day because it would have made for a much more interesting episode of the Rockets Collective, which we do early to midweek every week. Myself, Will and Brado of Rockets internet commentary fame. We're doing the Rockets Collective. Been doing that for several weeks now. And we talked about the most recent Jazz games and the Reed Sheppard performance that I talked about here on this podcast last week against the Warriors. And it was a decent episode. We felt pretty good about it, but I mean, we cut out early. We cut out after 45 minutes, normally do an hour, because we had pretty much hit everything we needed to hit. And we had the questions in from the live audience and everything, and we were just ready to go. It was time to go. But the info that we did not have yet, because it had not happened yet, because this was a middle of the night sort of development, was that Chris Paul, who reunited with the Clippers this season in what is going to turn out to be his final season in the NBA, after 21 NBA seasons, Chris Paul's retiring and was going to do so with the Los Angeles Clippers, where, look, I feel like Chris Paul made an impact pretty much everywhere that he went. But of course, his career is going to be defined and remembered, I think, most by his Clippers tenure and essentially turning the Clippers organization around as opposed to one that was never taken seriously for most of our lifetimes. The Los Angeles Clippers have not been a serious outfit. They were actually a joke of a franchise, the butt of many jokes, not just in the NBA, but one of those joke franchises across sports. And it was that way basically forever until Chris Paul got there in 2011. And so when it was learned that he would be back, and then it was later learned, I think earlier in November, that he announced on social media, I believe it was, that he'd be retiring after this season. It was kind of a heartwarming, sort of ceremonious type of situation. Now, never mind the fact that the Clippers have gotten off to a horrible start. They're one of the probably larger disappointments in all of the NBA after last season being one of the friskier teams in the Western Conference, if you will. They bring back Chris Paul, and then just, what is it? A little over a month into the season, couple of months into the season, in the middle of the night, we learn that Chris Paul has been sent home. And I don't even fully understand what that, like, I guess that's the language that Chris Paul used when he announced it sort of in the middle of the night on his Instagram. But they're going to try to trade him, I guess, after December 15th. And if they can't do that, then I guess they're just going to let him go. But this is kind of confusing because nobody really knows why or fully understands at this point why the Clippers let Chris Paul go. It's not like, and Lawrence Frank came out, their lead executive came out and said, hey, we're not blaming Chris Paul for our poor start. There are a number of reasons for it. But it isn't quite clear on what he is being blamed for, what the exact reason is for his sudden and abrupt departure, right? Chris Paul is not playing significant minutes. He's not making significant contributions on the court or significant detractions on the court because he's not playing significant minutes. And so it just seems Chris Paul's existence on the team overall seems far too inconsequential to make a move quite like this. And so it'll be really interesting over the coming days, over the next few weeks or so, or however long it takes for the truth to come out, to find out exactly what was the smoking gun or what was the inflection point. What was that moment where the Clippers decided, you know what, we're not any good. And this guy is not really necessarily helping or hurting our cause. He's just kind of on the team, but he's got a symbolic value of franchise legend, probably our greatest franchise player that we've ever had, who's going to retire in our uniform after this season. Like that was strictly the value of it, really sentimental, and then whatever he could provide for you as a veteran and as a leader. So it seems like too inconsequential of a roster spot and roster move. He's a healthy scratch in a number of games. Like he's just not playing enough for it to seem like it mattered. So I'm really curious. I know I've seen a little bit of like maybe some former players saying that he had to have said something or done something behind the scenes that annoyed or bothered somebody enough to where somebody important enough and with enough cachet to say, hey, you know what, let's just get rid of this guy. Let's just get this guy off the team. I'm not gonna lie to y'all. Reckless speculation. And look, I'm not gonna even speculate this. I'm just gonna tell you where my mind went. Okay. I have no inside information on this and really no reason to actually believe that this happened because there's been nothing that's been out there that indicates this. But I remember when they acquired Chris Paul, when they brought him back on the vet minimum, and it just occurred to me for a second, like, isn't James Harden still on that team? And and you're telling me that Chris Paul and James Harden are going to play together again? Like it was believable when James and Russell Westbrook reunited, the deal that sent Chris Paul out of Houston, and they played together again. Okay, that made sense. It made sense when James Harden and Kevin Durant reunited and played together again in Brooklyn. It even it even made a little bit of sense when, way late in the career now at this point, but Russell Westbrook and James Harden end up being together on the team again for a third time with the Clippers. And I thought that was a little weird considering how things ended in Houston, but I never got the sense that those guys didn't like or respect each other, which is a little bit different from how I remember it ending between Chris Paul and James Harden in Houston. And so I always thought, and I'll be honest, I have not followed this as closely since they've been teammates again with the Clippers, but I always thought that that was going to be a weird reunion, a weird pairing, bringing those two guys back together after whatever, however long it's been, 5 years since they played together. And so when this happened, or when I saw that this happened, my first thought was James Harden then got Chris Paul up out of another team, got him up off another roster. James Harden then got sick of Chris Paul again and got rid of him. That's reckless speculation. I got no reason to believe that, but I'd be lying if I didn't say, or if I said that that wasn't the first thing that came to my mind. What'd he do to James Harden? What James Harden, what did he see or hear from Chris Paul that he did not like? That was my thought. Now that could have nothing to do with nothing. It might not have nothing to do with James. I don't know what it has anything to do with. We're gonna find out. I'm pretty sure we're gonna find out. Somebody is going to tell this story. But it was just odd. It's odd. I feel like I'm seeing a little bit of overreaction from some NBA heads, from some basketball heads that are like, how could they do this? How could they do this to a franchise icon? I get it. I agree. But I feel like there's got to be an interpersonal element to this that just goes beyond or is just an aside from all of this historical context that we want to put on it. Chris Paul, the greatest Clipper ever, and is going out, and how could you do this to him in the middle of the night? Like it looks bad, seems petty, but I want to hear more. I want to hear the full story behind it before I rush to judgment and talk about how crazy of a move this is. No, I do think it's crazy PR. I think we can all agree on that whatever happened, that absent of like a physical confrontation or something. I don't even want to put this out there because I don't think Chris Paul is this type of guy, but like absent of him violating some sort of personal space of some sort, sleeping with somebody's wife, that type of stuff, right? Outside of that type of thing, I can't imagine what it would have been if it's just personality conflicts, what it would have been to where they couldn't have waited until morning. Like I'm talking about after the sunrise type of morning, or why they couldn't have waited until the 15th, or just, made this a little bit more organized, decent, if you will, decent and in order. This seems neither decent nor in order. And I'm just curious of why exactly that is. And I think we will find out. But in the meantime, it does raise the question, or bring about the point or idea of where he should end up, and if anybody should be itching to get Chris Paul on their team. Now, I don't think anybody should be itching to get Chris Paul on their team. We've seen that Chris Paul has very, very, very little left, if anything at all, left in the tank in the way of like Chris Paul as we know him. So don't take this podcast as me trying to oversell you on Chris Paul as a player in December of 2025. I'm not trying to do that. However, I do think the Rockets should at the very least consider spinning the block on Chris Paul. I think they should consider it. I do. Now, this is to say that I think they should consider this in a similar role to the one he was already playing on the Clippers, where he plays sparingly, but adds a little bit more value than, and this is the hope, right? Like, I don't know if he actually did this for the Clippers. Lord only knows. But my thought, if the Rockets were to spin the block on Chris Paul, is that he would add the sort of value that is not obvious to the naked eye or through the box score. Like, I don't think you add Chris Paul and all of a sudden your assists go up by a lot, or your, like, I don't think it's going to have a nominal impact on the Rockets in that way. But I do think that the Rockets should spin the block on Chris Paul, or at least have the conversation. Maybe they have the conversation, and then by the end of the conversation, the answer that they reach is no, which I would be fine with. But I think that they should talk about it. And if they talk about it in the way that I'm about to talk about it, I feel like they might end up actually trying to spin the block on one Chris Paul. And here's why. The Rockets don't have a point guard to speak of. They've got a handful of smaller guards that function somewhat as point guard at time, but they don't have a point guard really on the team with Fred VanVleet injured. This has been a talking point for them ever since Fred VanVleet got injured leading up to the season, in the weeks leading up to the season. And so, and that's shown I feel like it's reared its head at times, or a time or two for them, where you look out and you think, oh, you know what, they could, even though they have this really good record and they're beating up on bad teams for the most part, and they're hanging in there and competing against really good teams, and they look themselves like one of the better teams in the NBA, they could use a player that can keep them organized and in structure and on schedule and that type of thing. And they don't have that. They don't really, really have that. Reed Sheppard comes in and, I know he's in the starting lineup now, but, he comes in and kind of fills that role a little bit, but that's not exactly the player that he is. And Aaron Holiday is just really a kind of a two guard in a point guard's body. I feel that way about both he and Reed Sheppard to varying degrees, that all they are is built like a point guard physically, but they're actually more of combo guards, is what we would have called them back in the day. So if Chris Paul were to be added to the team, he would be like the sole one point guard on the team. Now, that don't mean he need to be out there playing all of these point guard minutes, But I do wonder, and I actually believe that there has to be some value in having Chris Paul there to help tutor, mentor, and guide specifically Reed Sheppard and more broadly the team at large, right? Like early in the season, I want to say I did this on the podcast, but I talked about having this hope that Kevin Durant, while not expected to be like the full-on leader of the team from a vocal standpoint, from a personality standpoint, because that's just not really how he's wired. I did have this hope that he would be willing to kind of step into that big brother role in a way that he's never really been asked to or required to in any of the other teams that he's played on, because everybody else was a peer. But now he's the 37-year-old where all the other really good players on the team are under 25, like more than a decade, more than 12 years younger than him. Like he's literally big bro unk status when he steps in, and should feel a certain level of comfort in terms of speaking out or being sort of the brains and big bro of the operation in ways that he wasn't before. Vocal leader, mentor, tutor, that sort of thing. Look, I don't feel like you got to ask Kevin Durant to do much more than what he's already doing, which is providing you that scoring punch and that reliability at the end of games, that closer ability. You're getting that from Kevin Durant. You're getting what you paid for. You still don't really have that mentor that I'm talking about on the team, I don't think. He's more of a lead by example. Jabari Smith Jr., follow him around and schedule your workouts around KD's workouts and that sort of thing. But who's the one that's really barking or really, setting that fire under the tails of everybody else whenever it's needed and whenever it's required? I think that person could be Chris Paul. Like Chris Paul, I feel like could provide some of whatever intangible that was left with Dylan Brooks being traded away for Kevin Durant, which is a trade. Look, clearly a trade-off that you would make 8 days out of the week. Okay, 8 out of the 7 days of the week you will make that trade. But there is something to be said for the attitude, the leadership, the tone setting that I feel like Dylan Brooks brought. And I think Chris Paul could bring a little bit of that, even though he wouldn't play as much. Hope to God he wouldn't play nearly as much, hardly at all, even really, but could provide that plus just the added benefit of like everything else that he provides, just in terms of the smarts and the basketball intelligence that I think goes, even far beyond what Dylan Brooks could have provided you, and certainly far beyond anything that they've already got on the roster. So I would be interested in that. I would be interested in that, so long as we're not talking about bringing Chris Paul in here to be the Chris Paul that he was when he came 8 years ago, or the Chris Paul that he was when he arrived, even in San Antonio, or some of these stops that he's made, in Phoenix. We're not asking him to be the Chris Paul that he was in recent years and all of these other teams that he's gone to since he left the Rockets. We're asking him, I would be asking him to be a similar version of what he's been with the Clippers. At least I think. Because the Clippers didn't let him go in the middle of the night. And I don't get it. I don't get it. I can't wait to find out why. But Chris Paul mentoring Reed Sheppard, who, to be clear, Reed Sheppard is not Chris Paul. Reed Sheppard does not have all of the attributes that make and that have made Chris Paul great. He's not nearly the defender. He's not nearly the facilitator. I don't think he's the player that Chris Paul is, the caliber player that Chris Paul is. But specifically his offensive game, when I talk about like the shot making, and that's where the comparison, the Reed Sheppard Chris Paul comparison, I think does play a little bit, is like they've got similar games as smaller guards who can find their spot on the floor and get their shot off despite being smaller guards. that's where it kind of starts and stops. But I think actually having him in the building, actually having him around, could create a little bit more overlap in their game. Like Reed Sheppard being able to pick Chris Paul's brain, or Chris Paul being able to offer up tips to Reed Sheppard on how to be a better facilitator, how to read. And look, he's got a pretty good enough feel of the game and feel for the game already. But the Chris Paul influence, I think, could be, from an intangible standpoint, very similar. The Chris Paul influence on Reed Sheppard, that is, could be very similar to the Kevin Durant influence on Jabari Smith Jr. I do believe that, so long as Chris Paul is not out there playing, which I don't think would be the case. But helping him with different aspects of his game like that, defensively, okay. Can we talk about that? Like the fact that Chris Paul, how many all NBA defense selections does he have? 9. Chris Paul, 12-time All-Star, 11-time All NBA selection, 9-time All Defensive selection. At 6 feet tall. Okay. Now I think he came into it with better defensive prowess and ability than Reed Sheppard. They're different kind of players in this way. But you don't think that Chris Paul could give some advice or some tips to Reed Sheppard on how to not be a cone out there? I'd like to think so. And it's not like it's going to cost you the normal sticker price of a Chris Paul, right? He signed the vet minimum with the Clippers. So I think that there's some value there. I think that it's something that's worth exploring. I would explore it and let Chris Paul be like at the end of the bench and retire as a Rocket. Hell, Clippers don't want you. We'll take you. I'll take you. Now, that's with all that being said, again, I want to reiterate, I do not know what this release is all about, what him being sent home in the middle of the night is all about. I would like more information on that and reserve the right to renege on everything that I just said, depending on what that is about. Like, what happened? Why would you do this to a franchise icon in the middle of the night during a season in which it looks like your season is headed for the toilet, like headed down the toilet? They talking about trading James Harden, blowing up the team. Like, what was the reason? What necessitated this? What are you making better by this? I'm curious, but absolutely something I feel like the Rockets should consider. Now, I want to move on to the Texans real quick and point out that they let go of another offseason acquisition that did not work out for them, and that was left guard Laken Tomlinson. I think the hope was that Laken Tomlinson would finally be the answer at left guard, where they've been trying to find an answer for a very long time now. Y'all will remember in 2022 when they drafted Derek Stingley Jr. with the number 3 overall pick, that several picks later, they had a second pick in the first round that they actually traded back a couple of picks and then selected Kenyon Green, a left guard out of Texas A&M, a Houston area native out from Atascocita. And that did not work. That did not work at all. And so this year, and they tried it all the way up until last year, right? And so this year, their solution was to go sign Laken Tomlinson, who, by my count, had not been good in the previous 3 seasons, at least, leading up to this. 4 seasons ago, he was good at one point, but the last 3 seasons, he had not been good. Not really sure exactly why the Texans thought that they could get the good out of him or recapture whatever it is that he was 4 years ago, but they didn't, and it didn't work out. Laken Tomlinson waived on Tuesday. We had seen over the last few weeks that they had been rotating. When Laken was playing, they were rotating him with Juice Scruggs, which is very odd. Very, very rarely do you see offensive linemen rotate that late into the season. Like, we're not talking about preseason games. We're talking about real life regular season games that matter, and they were rotating two guards that nobody was sure if either of them could really play. And it looked like Juice Scruggs, at the very least, was giving you a lot more than what you were getting from Laken Tomlinson, or at least, I don't know, a lot more, but giving you more than what you were getting from Laken Tomlinson. But then they decided that neither one of them was really good enough, which I couldn't necessarily fault them for. And they went and put out somebody that we had never heard of. And I have like yet to dedicate myself to really learning this person's name or the pronunciation of this person's name, because I don't feel like I was ever supposed to. I don't mean it disrespectfully. I just mean, like, this was weird and random and odd. And, like, I'm not going to sit up here and just, like, pretend like this was normal. I don't know what they were doing with, what was it, 62? They put out a dude that we had never seen before. That I'm talking about, not just like the general public. I'm talking about the people that go to training camp, the people that go to practice, the people that make it a point to memorize the roster to a large degree. Never heard of. Didn't know he was there. And then we not found out, but we're reminded that Jared Patterson is still on the team. I just assumed that they either gave up on Jared Patterson, that he was just kind of lost in the wilderness somewhere. And then they played him a little bit. And we were like, hey, Jared Patterson. Yeah, why you didn't try that before? Okay. So we've seen that. And then finally, over the last couple of weeks or so now, they have settled on Titus Howard again, who to be fair is the guy that they go to at left guard once all else fails. Once they don't have any more options, any more viable options, they feel like at left guard, Titus Howard is the dude that they go to. And sure enough, they've done it again. And it works out because they always seem to have, like, not enough guards, but way more tackles than they necessarily need. And so tackle surplus, guard shortage, but one of the tackles can play guard. And that's how they've been able to put the Band-Aid on it. That's how they've been able to sort of patch this thing together. And I must say, at least over the last 2 weeks, it's worked. It looks pretty good. They gave up no sacks against the Bills on that Thursday night game against the Bills. And then against the Colts, I don't even have it up in front of me, but I'm trying to remember. I feel like they gave up maybe two or three, but at least one of them was C.J. Stroud's fault. And I think another one was Ed Ingram getting beat. But Ed Ingram has been one of their better offensive linemen. You can live with a bad play here or there from him, because what he is giving you, the good that he is giving you, is really good. So nobody's here crushing Ed Ingram for getting beat on a play. If you want to just call that the only sack that they really gave up, that's 2 weeks, one sack given up, and they look pretty good in the run game. Like, they're actually moving people up front now. So to some degree, they have fixed their offensive line issues, or at least remedied them to some degree. That's what happens when you get to talking a little bit too fast and get a little bit too excited. But they have fixed their offensive line issues to some degree. But as I mentioned, the Laken Tomlinson release, or the waiving of Laken Tomlinson, does symbol, at least I think it symbols, yet another. Why isn't this working? It does symbol yet another failed Texans offseason acquisition. See if I can list them here. We just want to start with the offensive line. Look up Cam Robinson, somebody they paid $12 to $14 million to, or dedicated $12 to $14 million to. He ain't even make it to the bye week. And mind you, the bye week was one of the quicker. Like, I feel like, what did they have, the bye week after 6 games or something like that? Like, the bye week was just rolled up on you real quick. He didn't even make it that far before they ended up trading him. Who else? Austin Deculus is somebody that I've seen. I know it's not an offseason acquisition, but just looking at offensive linemen that have ended up elsewhere, I looked up and I see him starting for the Chargers and getting benched for the Chargers, and but being in the mix over there. I'm like, oh, all these offensive linemen that were here and then they're not here anymore. But let's see. You got the acquisitions. You got Cam Robinson, C.J. Gardner-Johnson, who made it just a couple of weeks before. Y'all remember that once they released him in a surprise release, you heard all of the they leaked all of the blaming of defensive breakdowns and lapses on his part that cost him plays and might have even cost him a game or two. Might have cost him a game or two. You could even make the case. I think you could credibly make the case that the Texans, who are now 7-5, that the 7-5 Texans could be 9-3 or 8-4 if they hadn't signed or traded for C.J. Gardner-Johnson. They could make that case, and he's someone who's contributed since to the Chicago Bears, who are, if I'm not mistaken, the number one seed in the NFC right now, one of the surprises of the league. So it's not like he was a terrible player, but he was an awful fit, it turns out. So that didn't work out. And C.J. Gardner-Johnson is who you got in the Kenyon Green trade. So Cam Robinson, C.J. Gardner-Johnson, Laken Tomlinson. These are all guys that were projected starters for this team that are no longer here. New acquisitions that were projected starters for the team that are no longer here. I think about some others that are still here that are not contributing in a way that I was expecting them to, especially after they made the roster in the case of one of them. But I'm thinking about, namely, Christian Kirk, Braxton Berrios. Christian Kirk's a guy who you expected, at least I expected, to be their clear and obvious number 2 receiver this year. That has not happened at all. At all. Braxton Berrios is someone who I thought could play like a poor man's Edelman or Amendola type of role in this Patriots-esque offense. And that hasn't really happened. I think he's had maybe 1 or 2 games where he's even shown up at all, really. And he continues to be a healthy scratch. So Kirk is at least getting on the field, but the impact is minimal. I know he had a touchdown against the Bills and has had a moment here or there, but by and large, in terms of the hit or miss, it's been mostly miss. So those are the ones that really stand out the most to me, is like off-season acquisitions that I thought, and Berrios, again, I should mention, I thought was going to be their return guy. I just assumed, especially once he made the team, oh, he's making the team because he's their return guy and he can offer you a little bit on some underneath stuff as an actual receiver, veteran, trustworthy for C.J. Stroud, all that type of stuff. But between Cam Robinson, C.J. Gardner-Johnson, Laken Tomlinson, all 3 of which are no longer on the team, and then Christian Kirk and Braxton Berrios, both of which are still on the team but making minimal to no impact, that's 5 offseason acquisitions that have just been swings and misses by the organization. Fortunately for them, they've done a really good job at acquiring young players. A really good job at acquiring young players, and it is the young players that are carrying this team. You think about, let's just talk about the defense for a second, right? With the exception of Danielle Hunter, who was a known commodity by the time he got here, a known dog before he got here, right? Double-digit sack guy before he signed with the Texans back when he was with Minnesota. Another Houston native too, by the way. Houston area native. He's actually from Katy. Not gonna kill him for that. But other than Danielle Hunter, defense is led, and of course Azeez Al-Shire, who's played quite a bit, from Will Anderson Jr. to Derek Stingley Jr. to Kamari Lassiter to Kalen Bullock you're seeing, especially on the defensive side of the ball, young players kind of lead the Jalen Petrie I throw in there. Young players kind of lead the way. Guys that are in their 2, 3, 4, fourth year or less, and drafted guys by the Texans who are the main contributors. Go over on the offensive side of the ball. Who are your most explosive players? Nico Collins is a little bit more of a vet now. He's in his, is this year 5 for Nico Collins? Yeah, so he's in his 5th year. So I don't know how much of a young player you want to call him, but I still look at him as a young player, at the very least homegrown, since you drafted him, right? He was there for the rough years, right? But he's on the other side of 25 now. I would still put him in there. Nico Collins, CJ Stroud, obviously. Woody Marks, your lead running back, is a rookie. Jaden Higgins is now somebody that I feel like is a reliable target for them. Jalen Noel has at least taken over some of the special teams, the return reps that you thought that were going to go to Braxton Berrios. That's Jalen Noel now. So and then of course on the offensive line you got Ariante Ursary, your starting left tackle, literally is a rookie. Your center, Jake Andrews, has not been in the league very long. So you got some really, really young players that are a part of the success of this team. And you got some older players that they tried to bring in that are very much hit or miss. Very much hit or miss. So I'm good with it. Like, I kind of wonder what took so long. Once they got to the point to where they were rotating, right? Once they got to the point to where they were rotating their guards, you had to feel like and I would wonder and question why wasn't that that side? Because they did not bring that in to be rotating them with somebody that was already there, and they decided couldn't play that position full time. So I was gonna get into the college football playoff nonsense. Maybe I'll do a separate episode and video on that. I'm really just kind of annoyed by the entire conversation about college football. I'm starting to wonder if I should just like eject from college football commentary and just watch the games and just be clueless to the conversations around it, because I find it to be super corny, lame company to be held, to be in, lame company to be in. But we can talk about that at a later date, at another time. I appreciate y'all for spending these few moments with me, this little half hour with me, the B Block Podcast, which you can find on YouTube. You can also find it on Spotify, on iTunes, wherever it is really that you get your podcast. And when you find it, make sure you subscribe, make sure you rate, make sure you review, and tell a friend. Until next time, y'all be good.